Today we are interviewing Dr. Joseph O'Rourke, Professor Emeritus at Wabash College, former chairman of the speech department. Joe's been a resident of Crawfordsville since 1960.
That's right.
Joe, where were you June 25th, 1950?
Well, I was probably home in St. Louis in the end of my sophomore year at the University of Missouri. And June 25th was when the war broke out.
It was a Sunday.
It was a Sunday. And I heard that and decided that I didn't know if the reserve was going to get antsy again, because I had been in the service in the occupation from 46 to 48, and when I got out they still had some claims on me. So I started looking at various options, and there was ROTC at the University of Missouri.
Which paid a munificent $25 a month extra.
You remember that, don't you?
Yes, I sure do.
Well, I was probably the least likely ROTC student they had, because I was always marching my men into a grease pit or some such thing. But anyway, after 2 years, I graduated in 1952 from the University of Missouri with every intention of being a high school speech teacher. Well, in 1952, I was also commissioned at commencement ceremonies, and at that same day got my orders to go to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for artillery school. Now, I'd had 2 years of artillery in class at Missouri, but they didn't think it took, and so they made us go through the whole thing again. And so,
how long did that take?
Well, we reported on September 1st, 1952, and I was there until December 9th, 1952. And it was in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a place known for barren plains and big hills, and that's where the artillery ranges were, and so on. So I went to school there and discovered my talents were not in shooting the cannons. In fact, one time I plotted a shot of mine, and my colleague and I, who was also a humanities major, plotted the thing, and it would have gone straight up and come straight down. And our major said, well, that would have removed one problem for the Army. so we had to do that again. But it's where I discovered my real talent was as forward observer. Now, that's the least desirable job in all of artillery. I mean, they shove you out there in the boondocks and ask you to sight targets and then direct fire to it. Well, by God, I was good at that. And I could see that all of a sudden I had a career ahead of me.
Did you fly in one of those little planes?
Oh, we did that too, yes. And fortunately, there was a pilot there who said, well, Lieutenant, if I were you, I'd just say that's over 500 and then drop it 600 and see what happens. So we did, and pretty soon I was zeroed right in on the target.
You learned how to bracket your fight.
Oh, indeed we did. That was always the thing. You wanted to get one out there before it and one after it, and then move from there. And so,
from Fort Sill, where did you go, Joe?
Well, it was December 9th that we graduated, and at Thanksgiving of my tour at Fort Sill, my future wife, Beverly, came down for a visit. And we got engaged and called her folks and said, there's going to be a wedding. Well, she had taken a job in Chicago with a big advertising agency and was working on the program, The Great Gildersleeve. Do you remember that?
Yes, I sure do.
Well, anyway, she had to give notice there and come home and organize a wedding. Now, her mother wasn't very good at organizing much of anything. And so on the wedding day, we had 2 florists appear, and had a lot of flowers. It looked more like a gangster's funeral than anything else. And so we were married, and this is about December 27th. And the idea was we would go to Camp Atterbury, where I was ordered, to the 31st Division. And we'd get a place, and all of a sudden we would be man and wife living in our first apartment. Well, we got down to Atterbury, and there was no room anywhere. That camp had filled up with all kinds of officers and all kinds of wives and so forth. And so we got there, and there was no room at any of the inns and no rooms in the town of Edinburgh. And so finally, in desperation, we went to the Chamber of Commerce in Columbus, Indiana. And they said, well, we don't take listings like that, but as a typical of those small towns. She says, but I have a friend who has an apartment, and if you pass inspection, she may rent that to you. And so Bev and I, just 3 days after we were married, were being interviewed by this lady for an apartment. And we passed. So we moved in on New Year's Eve, and on New Year's Day I reported to Camp Atterbury and was promptly assigned to a training division at Camp Atterbury. It was the 31st Division, National Guard outfit out of Alabama, and that was in name only because there was such a revolving door for everybody in that division that there were very few left from the Alabama origins. Well, I was assigned to write lectures for officers to give to troops.
Troop information and education.
Well, that wasn't yet. This was first of all on such mundane things as map reading.
Oh boy.
And so I had to learn all about map reading and write a lecture for an officer to give to the troops. Well, they had what was then known as quotas for various schools. And so the battalion got a notice that they needed a lieutenant to come to Troop Information and Education School. So I went.
Where was that?
That was on the same base, but it was in 5th Army. 5th Army was the major unit there, and 31st Division was the other unit there. Well, I was just lucky because everything they had in that course I had had in my speech training at the University of Missouri. And somehow I got the highest grade they'd ever had recorded in the course. And so that made the camp newspaper. And it just so happened about that time, a captain was leaving the service, and he was the Troop Information and Education Officer. So I was appointed out of the battalion to the Troop Information and Education section, and was told to go down there and meet the captain. He'd show me everything to do. Well, I walked into the Troop Information and Education thing, and there was the captain and one clerk and one sergeant. And so I said hello to the captain and said, now, what is it you do? And he said, I go. I'm leaving. Goodbye. Good luck. And so I started my career on that auspicious basis. Now, he was a captain, and he was heading for major, I think, but the TO called for a major in that position, which meant that I was on the staff of the 31st Division. Now, being a second lieutenant on a staff where they're all majors and colonels and above is sort of like being a busboy in a restaurant. If ever anything is needed, they say, Lieutenant, would you go get this for me? Would you do that? And that included cocktail parties where I ended up serving a lot of drinks to the higher officers. I finally worked out something I was supposed to do. I was one to give a lecture once a week on how well we were doing in Korea. and that was a case of invention. I was also to supervise basic training, because many of the troops couldn't read at the third grade level. And so they went to school every night after training. And that's what my sergeant did. He was a truant officer for the students. And the way it worked is that every night a truck would drive by company headquarters and pick up those who had to go to school. And sometimes they made it and sometimes they didn't. And my Sergeant McGraw, a very harsh sounding man, but just a very kind man, he would find out who didn't come, and the next morning he was on the telephone calling the company clerk. Where were your troops last night? We had the school going. Oh, we're sorry, but we got in late for maneuvers and so on. So anyway, that was a major portion of my job. The third was to supervise the Army Education Extension courses, USAFE.
Madison, Wisconsin.
Yada, Madison, Wisconsin. And they gave me a civilian to do that. And the fourth was to inspect officers lecturing the troops. Well, I didn't know what in the world I was supposed to do there, but anyway, I took to heart that I ought to do my duty. And so I went out, and lo and behold, one of the first lecturers I had to critique was a guy who was using my lecture on map reading. And he wasn't doing it very well. I mean, he was kind of mumbling into his manuscript, and he didn't much care if it got across. And of course, the basic trainees, they would sound asleep. You know, they'd get into these lecture halls and they'd sit down in their wet, dirty clothes. And it was obvious they were tired. And so they'd go to sleep. And so periodically, every 10 minutes, he'd say, okay, jab your neighbor. And they'd go boom, boom, boom to wake each other up. Well, I wrote a critique on this young man, and I thought it was kind. But my goodness, I got a call from the colonel in the division. He said, now, Lieutenant, you've written this critique about this other lieutenant, and I want to know what you mean by all these things. Eye contact and communication quality and so on. And I said, well, sir, it's just basic speech material. It's everything I said were things that we expect in a good public speaker. And he said, but it's not in the manual that way. So he had a manual there on what lecturers should do. And I had not cited paragraph and verse in that manual of what the officer should be doing. For one thing, he should have been at parade rest with his hands behind his back and, you know, very stiff. Well, when I teach speech, I tell people don't do that. That's the equivalent of goose guard. And as a result, I was laying it on there and saying that you ought to be looser and more communicative with your troops and so on. And the colonel didn't buy that. He said, if you're going to do another inspection, you go by the manual and cite page and verse of anything you say. And so that rather limited what I could do in that area.
I can imagine knowing Army regs.
Yes. Well, I was Troop Information and Education Officer for about 4 months, and then in April of '53, mind you, just before that, Stalin had died, and
yes,
that upset the international scene. And I remember my lecture on the impact of what would happen because Stalin had died. I don't know what I said, but it must have been all right because it was a very lively discussion by those people that were all heading for Korea. But about that time, we got notice that we were going to have the Inspector General's inspection. Now that meant that a troop from Washington, from the Pentagon, would come down and inspect every unit of the division and see if they were fit for combat and fit for what they were doing. Well, I got the guy from Troop Information and Education. His name was Colonel Smythe, I believe. And he introduced himself as Romeo Smythe. And I thought, that's a devil of a name for an officer to carry. But he was inclined to ask some interesting questions. For instance, he asked my clerk, show me how you would get a truck request. And my clerk, dear old Taylor, answered, what color farm is that, sir? I knew almost immediately I was in trouble. And we opened up Taylor's file, and they were beautifully color matched. Blue farms, red farms, yellow farms, and so on. Well, of course, you did all sorts of things on those various farms, and I had thought he would use something creative like the alphabet and so on, but no, he had them by color. And so when he was asking for some material in those files, it was always an adventure to see if we could find it. And he wanted one or two other things. But the high point of the visit was always the cocktail party for the visiting team given by the general. Now, our general was called by the troops Hollywood Harry. That's because in every day room, he had a white silk scarf on and a helmet and had sort of that patent look to him off into the distance. And so Harry made sure there was a 8 by 10 of that in every day room. Well, Harry knew how to put on a party. And so the 31st Division, in addition to being from Dixie, the Dixie Division they were called, had a kilted pipers group. 4 pipers that were brought because Harry was Irish and he thought he needed a pipers group. And so they played all during the reception. At that time, I had Bev with me, and I introduce her to Romeo Smythe, and he looks at her and says, honey, you can just call me Romeo. And I knew we were in for trouble then. And he said, Lieutenant, would you go get us a couple of martinis? And so I did. Now, my good wife doesn't drink very often, and here she was being confronted by Romeo and his martinis. And so he very quickly finished his and says, Lieutenant, would you mind go getting us a couple more? And I see Beverly pouring hers on a plant. And I also see that plant starting to wilt. And as the evening went on, she was pouring more and more into that poor plant. I'm sure it never survived, and Romeo kept telling about his exploits in World War II and at the Pentagon. Well, we got through that, and the TI&E section got a above satisfactory mark. And I was pleased with that, and so was the colonel in charge of it, and so on. But right after that, I got my orders for Korea. So I didn't think there was cause effect there, but nevertheless, we packed up this old 48 Nash we had, and went to St. Louis, and I left the car with her father, and we hired ourselves out as drivers to the West Coast. At that time, car dealers were still transporting cars by drivers they would hire. And so if we just changed the oil once on the way, we got to drive the car all the way to the west. We paid for the gas, drove the car all the way to the West Coast with our belongings and so on. I was headed for Camp Stohlman.
Pittsburgh, California.
Pittsburgh, California. You know the place.
Yes, I have been through Stoneman twice. It no longer exists, Joe.
I know. I heard that.
It's Stoneman Park.
It's Stoneman Park?
Yes.
I didn't know that. Well, anyway, I ended up at Stoneman, and it was sent Beverly home to St. Louis, and she flew back, and I was sitting there waiting for orders to go over to Korea. At that time, they had an operation called gyroscope, which meant every lieutenant got a platoon. And so eventually they matched me up with a platoon, and I was on orders to leave about the end of, I think it was July 30th, somewhere in there. Well, we're sitting around camp waiting for things to happen, and all of a sudden the truce broke out. These talks had been going on for almost a year. And to the surprise of everyone, suddenly the North Koreans agreed to the truce. And that
Back
was
at the 38th
parallel. And I've never seen the Army act so quickly in my career, but they sent out a telegram immediately. All officers with more than 2 years total service were eligible for release. Well, of course, I'd had 2 years as an enlisted man in the occupation. And so I headed down to the personnel office. And this young lady back there said, well, yes, that's true, but I've already got you on orders. And we've got your platoon formed. And so you're going to have to go. And I said, even if I'm eligible for release? She says, yes. And I said, is there any other way? And she says, well, yes, if you get me a substitute for your orders. Well, there was a challenge. So I went over to the BOQ, Bachelor Officers' Quarters, and walking in was like a gift from heaven. A young fellow in jodhpurs with boots from Texas A&M. He had just finished school too, and he came in flaunting all of his A&M finery. And I said, man, do you want to hang around here for a couple of weeks? He said, oh, no, I'm ready to get going. I said, well, I can help you. So I did. So I went back to personnel. And I had this young lieutenant in tow. And he was eager. He said, yes, ma'am, if you put my name on those orders, I'll take that platoon over and we'll be in Korea in no time. He said, well, first of all, Lieutenant, you have to sign into the camp. And you also have to get processed. And so she says, Lieutenant O'Rourke, if you'd like to borrow our Jeep, you may. And so she loaned me the Jeep, and I took this kid around to get his shots, to get his gear, to get he had to join the officers club and then resign the same day. And I got him going and finally got him back to the BOQ all ready to go. And he was to leave the next morning. And so I said, well, congratulations, Lieutenant, you're on your way. And he said, thank you so much, sir. And so I went back and said, put me back in the pool now. We've got him going in place of me. That night I went into Pittsburgh and had an Italian dinner. As you'll recall, it was a very Italian community there. And I called Beverly and said, I've lost my job. And you could just hear the hoops and hollers going on there. She telling her mother-in-law and said, well, he's not coming back here, is he? She says, no, don't worry. We're going to get back in school. And so from about the 1st of August until the 30th of August, she got my records together and got me back at the University of Missouri into graduate school.
Great.
I'd had some graduate work as an undergraduate, and so there was no big problem there. I'd already been admitted. And so she went down and found an apartment and found a job, which I thought was very efficient of her. And so I'm sitting out at Stohlman now waiting for the Army to drudge up some orders for me, and they didn't have anything for me to do. So they gave me temporary duty. Now you may remember there was a steamship, or a riverboat, that would take the troops from Stohlman down to the docks. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that. I never took the ship. We were flown.
Oh, you were flown.
Directly from California to Haneda Airport in Tokyo, Japan.
Well, you don't know what it's like to have 16 days on a troop ship then, do you?
No, I came home on a Higgins boat.
Whew.
Fortunately, the Pacific was as calm as a pond.
At that time, they were still using these old converted tankers for troop ships, and we had to take a load, it was just about enough for the ferry boat. And they went down the Pittsburgh River. And this was a civilian crew that ran the thing, but they had to have one officer in charge. And so in the morning, I'd go in and they'd count the troops and get them, put them on the ship, and I'd have to sign for them. I don't know what would have happened if one went AWOL overboard, but anyway, when I got down there, I had to count them all to make sure they were all there. And they loaded right from the ferry onto the troop ship for departure the next morning. So I did that for 30 days. And it was a lovely bit of duty. You know, you sat up in the cabin house and the seagulls were swarming around you and you cruising down the river. It took about 2.5 hours to get down there. And then you drove back in a bus while they turned the ferry around and brought it back up the Pittsburgh River for the next load. Well, I did that until about 30 days, and then I was given my release and told that I would be discharged at Fort Sheridan in Illinois. So I did and got discharged there and came home to St. Louis. And Beverly and I didn't last long at her mother's. I think that was all for the good. And got to Columbia, and I was enrolled in graduate school 1 year after I had graduated. And that's the way I got my master's degree. We did it in a year, and after that my advisor said, would you like to go to Paradise? And I said yes, and that's how I got to Hawaii. That started my teaching career. So this was a year, you know, just 1 year. But when I think of the things that happened during that year, and here we were, two young people just married, thrown around like so much flotsam. It was a
momentous year.
Oh yes, and we don't regret that at all, but it was certainly a moment of transition.
Tell me, Joe, you didn't get to shepherd a troop train back to Sheridan?
No, they flew me back there. They discovered air at that time. But
when I got out, I took a troop train from Camp Stohlman to Fort Benning, Georgia. I was OIC, officer in charge.
You had some of the same duty.
Well, it was fun.
Yeah. Well, that pretty much covers my service in the Korean War, and no combat whatsoever, but...
Well, you're lucky.
Yeah. Well, I certainly had been into the Far East, 2 years in Tokyo, and had no desire to see anything of Korea, and so I really did want to get on with school.
I can fully appreciate your sentiments.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Well, thank you, Alex.